As negotiations continue in the Government of National Unity, Build One South Africa says the door is not yet closed for the party to consider the GNU. I'm now joined by party leader Mmusi Maimane. Tate Maimane, good evening and thank you so much for joining us. Now, you led a delegation that met with the ANC over GNU negotiations, which you describe as fruitful. Is this an indication that Bosa is urging closer to being the 11th member of the GNU?
Good evening and good evening to fellow South Africans. We certainly expressed in no uncertain terms that what our job as Build One South Africa was to be constructive. And what we mean by that is that the first objective was to say, which we came to an agreement with, is that the process of establishing a government needed to be had be foregrounded with a plan for delivery for 60 million South Africans. And in the absence of that, Bosa cannot be a part of a GNU because naturally it becomes confusing as to where you think the government is going to go. That's the first thing. The second thing is you can't capacitate the bureaucracy to be able to do the things it needs to do in order that even if things change at government, there's still a delivery plan. And thirdly, we made it very clear to them that ultimately as Build One South Africa, you can't have a GNU that is not accountable anyway. The first place we've been elected to is to the National Assembly and Parliament, and we'll play a constructive role of holding government to account. And if government doesn't do the job it's supposed to do or does do the job it wants to do, then we will support and endorse that. So that was the nature of the meeting, and that's why we describe it as constructive and fruitful. It doesn't mean that it means that we are in the GNU. I think we're beginning to understand better the fact that as Bosa, we have a role to play that South Africans have elected us to do in that way.
And in that process that you say that needs to be foregrounded with a plan, you've put forward some non-negotiables for your inclusion in the GNU. And I mean, these include, among other things, the reform in education, eradicating crime, and a zero tolerance for corruption. How will you ensure that these are not just on paper as terms to finalize an agreement, but rather policies that will translate into tangible action as promised to your constituency?
I mean, I think this is a very important moment for our country because a starting point is always to say, what is the role of Parliament? Because all we've seen of Parliament is motions of no confidence, etc. But it's going to be the most important institution in our country for the next 7 years. And I would argue probably even more important than the role that has been played by the judiciary in the last while, because there you put a private member's bill to say a person who's out on bail cannot be allowed to come and be a member of Parliament. That flies in the face of saying you are fighting corruption, for example. You can then use private members' bills or bills, which now suddenly can get broad support when you say economic inclusion must require a youth service that looks like a national civilian service, and parties can come around it. So suddenly there's a constructive nature without having to be in the executive. And these are the things that we're going to begin to enhance going forward. So I think that already is beginning to indicate to us how we put the action that we're going to put and the role that we're going to play in Parliament.
So was the inclusion of Zizi Kodwa discussed in your meeting? I mean, when you put forward examples in terms of zero tolerance when it comes to corruption, such examples are certain things that you're able to put forward in terms of action, what the ANC would put forward as opposed to what they just say.
Absolutely. And that's why I say to me, one of the discussions we had was the statement of intent. And it's nice to put words on a statement of intent to say, look, you are going to fight corruption. But when you then send people who are out on bail to Parliament, as is Zizi Kodwa, it simply flies in that face. So we disagree, and we raise that point. We also will raise other points to say, we can all talk about job creation as an example. We've campaigned on a job in every home. Let's be clear. These are the programs. We spoke about the township economy. We spoke about some of the economic issues in communities. How do we include those? Because I again want to say what cannot happen in the next administration is what is now called a federation of government, where if a party has the following portfolios, it can do with that portfolio what it wants. You can't, because naturally government acts constitutionally as a collective in cabinet and works in conjunction or is accountable to Parliament. We must be accountable to one plan, We must hold one president to account. It certainly that can't be when there's a problem. I must then write to all members of the GNU to find out what it is. The president must account. So for us, we raised all of these points to say the NC, we can't just sign on the basis of a statement of intent. It's not enough. You need a tangible plan. And also, lastly, given that many of the South Africans, 60 to 70% of them, voted for parties at one stage or another, supported something like the NDP, it can act as a basis of something we can update, take forward, and then say to ourselves, what additional actions can we take in the immediate and what further consultation can we go going forward? So that when you do pick a cabinet minister for education and you look at what the NDP says, it says focus on STEM subjects. And so we can be able to say that's what we would advance constructively on that basis. And then we build on from there. Then that way, no party comes into education and says we'll do with it what we please.
Just on that thought, and especially on the thought when it comes to creating jobs in every home, as part of your manifesto, the party's pivotal focus was on creating jobs. And part of doing that was to declare every township a special economic zone and by radically upskilling individuals in order for them to become employable. Your deputy leader, Nobuntu Hlazo-Webster, has carved her teeth extensively in business over the last couple of years. Would the portfolio of small business development be what Bosa would be eyeing as a ministry should the opportunity arise in order to achieve this goal?
Yeah, absolutely. And in part, it's why when the question is always put what portfolios, it's not just a matter of serving in cabinet in this instance. It's also a matter of what portfolio committees as an opposition you serve in. Because the size of our party means we can't cover all the portfolios. So I'll be looking quite carefully at finance, because to declare something a special economic zone, you need to be able to offer the appropriate tax rebates that go into that. And I think we could do some of that work in finance, and the appropriations bill will certainly lobby them for that, because suddenly you don't have a majority that you can just pass things willy-nilly. You can have discussions about it. And then also small business, education, safety. These were part of the portfolio plans that we put forward to our electorate, and we will certainly allow ourselves the freedom to be able to say, how do we speak for those? Because those affect the majority of citizens in our country.
Lastly, the EFF today has penned a letter to the ANC asking for a review of that statement of intent, which would not include the DA and the Freedom Front Plus. Would these requests be a deterrent for Bosa in any way or shape in terms of your negotiations that you had with the ANC yesterday?
Look, we're certainly not going to, I don't deal with parties and ascribe what race those parties are. I look at policy and I decide what goes on from there. I've had engagements with Mr. Groenewald, and certainly I have a history with the DA. I also appreciate the fact that, for me, if the plan was to speak to how do we build economic inclusion for South Africans, particularly South Africans who are left out, parties that oppose that view, we cannot work with. Parties that advance corruption, we cannot work with. Parties that don't believe the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, we cannot work with. And parties that are racist, if they pronounce on racist acts, we cannot work with. So I think these issues, we should rather than sitting around going, this party is a black party or a white party, I think that's a misnomer. I think we have a problem of whiteness broadly, if you want to talk about a superior attitude. Then if a party wants to bring that to the attitude, that is not something that is given to a particular party. And a particular individual can bring that. So for me, if we leave that at the door and say, how do we work for all South Africans? And that's an invitation to black and white South Africans to work towards that ideal. I think we can participate together. And in my engagement, even with parties like the Freedom Front Plus, I found them, even though they represent Afrikaner South Africans, have never said that must come at the expense of black South Africans as an argument. So that is a basis upon which we would engage them on a plan to say, how do we deliver for South Africa?
So are you implying that the EFF doesn't want to work with the Freedom Front Plus and the DA based on whiteness and not on policy?
I think they certainly, in the letter that they've penned, I didn't get the fundamental questions of policy that they raised. They merely, and so that in part should be something that must be interrogated with the EFF. And certainly the DA also has had its own issues about saying it needs to rescue South Africa from the EFF, which I think at times narrows the space for conversation. As South Africans, I may not agree with your policies, but I must be willing to hear you. And that's the spirit with which we must approach this moment. For if we don't learn from the 94 moment, where ultimately even the worst of enemies were able to sit around the table, today in 2024, South Africa can ill afford to be polarized on racial grounds. Because my fear is simply that between now and 2029, this country will further fragment, and it won't be a question of black versus white or Indian versus colored. It will soon be Zulu nationalism versus another Xhosa nationalism or Tswana nationalism. And then before we know it, we've built a society upon which everybody lagers back to their racial groupings or tribal groupings, and we divide our country rather than celebrating that in our united in our diversity, as our constitution says, we can be able to realize that we don't all hold the same puzzle piece. We all hold different puzzle pieces of South Africa, and if we bring them together, can create quite a beautiful picture for a nation that can thrive.
All right, Mmusi Maimane, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. That was Build One South Africa leader Mmusi Maimane speaking to us there about their negotiations with the ANC in the government of national unity.